Today we're going to finish section 7.3, and we were at the very end of this section, and we had one more problem to do. Here we go. Example number 6 says, some addition problems are easier to compute with fractions and others are easier to compute with decimals. So I have heard it said, though certainly it wasn't in this classroom, I hate fractions. None of you guys would say that, would you? Of course not. You wouldn't do that to me. The reality is that sometimes it's easier to actually work with fractions than it is to work with decimals. So we're going to take a look at an example of that. This one says, for example, if we had 1 over 7 plus 5 over 7, it's a lot easier to add those two numbers together than to add the repeating decimal 142,857 and 7.714,285. Okay, would you agree? The fact that those are repeating and none of the numbers match up and it looks really ugly and there's 6 of them that's repeating, that doesn't look so friendly. However, the other opposite is also true. If you had 0.4 and 0.25, it's easier to add that in decimal form than it is to add 2/5 and 1/4. Okay, so we're going to describe situations in which we think it would be easier to work with fractions than decimals and vice versa. So we're kind of making a comparison list of when we like to work, or when it's easier at least to work with fractions versus when it's easier to work with decimals. So taking this as an example and then thinking about what you do know about fractions, when is it nice and or easy, clean, to work with fractions? Yeah, when the denominators are the same, that's really nice, right? So when they have common denominators. We'll pause there for a moment and think about decimals. When do you like working with decimals? When they're short, so that they terminate with few numbers of decimals. So when there are few decimal places. Does that sound okay? There's one more thing I think we need to write somewhere, and I don't know if we want to write it in a positive description or in a negative description. But there is a case where working with decimals is downright nasty. It's on the screen. The repeatings, right? The things that repeat but they don't match perfectly, right? Like if I had 0.3 repeating and 0.3 repeating, that's fine. I don't mind that so much. But when I have these two examples right here, these two numbers as examples, they don't match up in any way, shape, or form. So the repeating part makes them awful to work with. So at some point in here, I think we could write that the fractions are easier to work with when they represent non-terminating, or you could put the phrase repeating decimals. When you get something that gives you a repeating decimal, it's not so easy to work with that. The fractional expansion is much nicer. I mean, even to the extent that if you worked with, 1/3 as a fraction and 1/7 as a fraction, well, 1/3 is 0.3 repeating. 1/7 is apparently this 0.142857 repeating. I'd still rather do it in fractional form because I don't have the same kind of expansion to be adding together, which is unfriendly. Can you think of any other cases where it's nicer to work with one versus the other?
I don't know if this is working here, but Lynn and I were talking yesterday about how it's easier to compare decimals. Like the answer to something, like which one is greater.
Yeah, okay, so decimals are nice for, because you can use them in comparison by place value. Does that sound okay?
I think that depends on which one you like, though. Like, I would much rather work with fractions if I'm comparing something, because I can make the denominator the same. Even if they're big numbers, I think it's more of a want, or like,
Okay,
preference.
so you'd like to say something like comparison with the same denominator,
Yeah.
or being able to get them to be the same denominator. They already have the same denominator. That's very nice to be able to compare, right? Yep, that's true. Anything else you can think to add to this list or to either list? What I'd like to get you to think about as you make this list is, as much as maybe some of you don't particularly like working with fractions, there are cases when flat out working with fractions is easier to do There are. And to be honest, working with fractions in mathematics beyond the kind of mathematics you guys are going to be teaching, which I get, you're not thinking about, calculus like we were when we first came in and we were having this discussion. Fractions are much easier to work with. Much, much, much easier to work with than decimals. And so, in as much as you may not like fractions, try not to push that onto your kids that you teach, because some of them are going to be in careers where that's actually going to be something that they need to be able to work with in a positive sense, okay? I have to remember that all the time when I think about doing stuff with science and history. Those are not things that I particularly enjoy, and I don't want to have that pushed onto my personal children when I help them with homework. It doesn't matter, it's just history. This is not a good method, right? So try to keep that in mind as you're working with parts of mathematics, maybe even a lot of the parts of mathematics that you don't particularly like, all right?